On Myrtle Avenue, where Bushwick presses against Bedford-Stuyvesant, the station is visible before it is understood. Steel ribs over Broadway, a double-decked lattice that looks like a permanent construction site that was simply never finished. The lower level still carries trains, the upper level does not. People stand on the live platforms beneath brown canopies and green columns, and they do not look up for long, because looking up invites a question with no comfortable answer. What is the second station for? Officially, this is Myrtle Avenue, Broadway, an elevated express station at the intersection of Myrtle Avenue and Broadway in Brooklyn, serving the J and M at all times and the Z during rush hours in the peak direction, with multiple bus connections below. It opened first as a lower-level station on June 25, 1888, on the Broadway elevated. Then the upper level opened April 27, 1889, to create a transfer to the Myrtle Avenue elevated. The upper level closed on October 4, 1969, when service west of Broadway ended and the line south toward downtown Brooklyn was abandoned. That is the public version. It reads cleanly: opened, expanded, modernized, then partially retired. It turns history into a list of dates, and dates into a manageable surface. But stations are not primarily lists. They are loads and tolerances. They are corrosion rates and vibration signatures. They are maintenance budgets, paint systems, rivets, bolt holes, and the quiet arithmetic of fatigue. Myrtle Avenue Broadway was built when New York's elevated railways were treated as a practical answer to a practical problem. Streets were clogged, horses were dying in volume, and new neighborhoods needed connection. In those early years, the Myrtle Avenue line ran west into downtown Brooklyn and, for decades, even reached Manhattan via the Brooklyn Bridge to a terminal at Park Row. It was part of the city's first attempt at mass movement above ground before the subway buried itself under it. The record shows what happened when the subway era matured. In 1944, elevated service over the Brooklyn Bridge ended, and the western segment of the Myrtle Avenue line was cut back. Later, in 1969, the remaining section west of Broadway was closed, and demolition followed. The city's logic was partly aesthetic, elevated lines were eyesores, and partly financial. A transit museum historian would later summarize the choice in blunt terms. The authority studied reinforcing the structure to carry modern steel cars, but decided the upgrade was too costly. The line was, in a certain precise sense, allowed to become old enough to justify its own removal. There is a photograph that fixes this mood better than any memo. It shows Myrtle Avenue station platforms facing west, the steel framing corrugated with decades of paint, and beyond it, the pale geometry of the city. It is not a ruin in the romantic sense. It is functional infrastructure with a dead limb attached. A second image, older in tone, shows the Myrtle Avenue line in its larger shape, maps, diagrams, a route that once continued west into Brooklyn's Civic Center and beyond. It is the difference between the body and the scar. To speak of closure after structural safety failures is to speak in New York in a language that is deliberately cautious. Agencies rarely describe a structure as failing in public until the choice has already been made. More often, there are substitutions, out of an abundance of caution, state of good repair, deteriorating conditions, end of useful life. These are technical phrases, but they are also social phrases. They hold back panic. They protect the system's idea of itself. For the Myrtle Avenue corridor, there is an official modern echo. In the 2010s, the MTA and partner agencies described the Myrtle Avenue line's junction structures and bridges as having deteriorated over a century and stated that full replacement was necessary rather than partial repair. The Fresh Pond Bridge and the Myrtle Viaduct, both over 100 years old, were described as past the point where maintenance could plausibly stand in for reconstruction. This is how a rail structure dies when it is not allowed to die suddenly. It is not a collapse and a headline and an immediate tragedy. It is a gradual narrowing of the margin between safe and still operating. It is the conversion of routine inspection notes into urgent work orders, and the conversion of urgent work orders into closures when the work is not done quickly enough. If you stand below the station at street level, you hear the system more clearly than you see it. Above you, wheel sets strike joints and switches, and the sound arrives through steel into the air as a long metallic argument. The elevated structure amplifies small imperfections. A slightly flattened wheel can sound like a defect in the track. A worn rail can sing at a frequency that reads as mechanical distress. At Myrtle Avenue Broadway, there is also the junction just east of the station, where the M diverges from the JZ via a rare at-grade junction with slip switches. It is a complicated piece of track work, one of the few remaining level junctions on revenue tracks. Complexity in track is not inherently unsafe, but it concentrates maintenance needs in a small space. When something goes wrong there, it goes wrong in public, under load, with passengers present. And above all of it is the closed level. The abandoned upper platform served trains bound for downtown Brooklyn via the Myrtle Avenue Elevated. When the line south of Myrtle Avenue Broadway was shut down in 1969, this upper level stopped being an interface with the public and became something else, a sealed volume in the middle of a working station. It is still there, and footage exists of its emptiness. Gray daylight filtering across old platform edges, fencing, the suggestion of two tracks that no longer exist. The presence of an abandoned level inside an active station does something subtle to the psychology of the place. It breaks the promise that transit architecture usually makes, that every corridor leads somewhere, that every door is either locked for a reason you can accept or open for a reason you can trust. Here, the reason is history, and history is rarely comforting when it is trapped behind a wall. The city has a habit of leaving remnants when removal is inconvenient. Wikipedia's description of the Myrtle Avenue line includes a blunt detail. After the 1969 closure, much of the western portion was demolished, but at least some structure lingered as a stub, and the station itself retained the ghost of the former route in its upper level. In the same way, Myrtle Avenue Broadway retains the choreography of transfers that no longer happen. Stairs that once moved bodies from one platform to another now terminate at locked gates and blank panels. The station continues to announce itself as a place of connection while permanently withholding one of its connections. When people remember the Myrtle Avenue L, they often describe it with nostalgia. Wooden cars, cane seating that caught on clothing, the odor of industry, breweries, mills, carried through open windows. That recollection is valuable, but it is also incomplete because it makes the infrastructure sound like a quaint artifact rather than a machine built to absorb stress. The line that closed in 1969 was not just old in the cultural sense, it was old in the metallurgical sense. It was held up by elements whose protective coatings had to be renewed, whose joints had to be watched, whose foundations had to be defended against water and vibration. And even in modern agency language, the basic principle remains. Paint is not aesthetic, it is a barrier against corrosion, and corrosion is one of the simplest ways for steel to become unsafe without appearing dramatically broken. If the title is treated as a real historical mystery, Myrtle Avenue Station closed after structural safety failures, then the first task is to understand what closed could mean in a station like this. The upper level was closed in 1969, clearly and publicly. The lower level remains active. The station has not vanished, it has been partially amputated and left to heal around the missing part.
That kind of closure is rarely clean. It leaves transitional periods, weeks, months, sometimes years, where the public still brushes against the edge of the shutdown. Signs are updated slowly, old platform markings survive in paint layers. Maintenance crews treat the abandoned area as both hazard and storage, a place to move through but not to linger. In the record, the last run on the old Myrtle Avenue L drew crowds. The cars were stripped. The tone was ceremonial, but the subtext was that a structure had reached a condition where it would no longer be trusted with the next generation of trains. To say structural safety failures is to say that the structure's ability to carry load had become uncertain under the rules of its time. Those rules change. Early elevated lines were built for lighter cars, different braking patterns, different service frequencies. They were built with assumptions about maintenance labor and the value of replacement that no longer held. By the late 1960s, with the system under financial strain and the city in a long slide toward deferred maintenance, failure often meant something quieter than collapse. It meant inspectors writing conditions that would require either immediate heavy intervention or permanent withdrawal of service. Myrtle Avenue Broadway is a place where those decisions are preserved in architecture. It is a working station that keeps a closed station inside it. That arrangement is not unique in New York, but it is unusually visible here, because the abandoned level is not buried deep behind sealed tunnels. It is stacked above the platform where people still wait every day. The documentary record begins there, with what can still be seen: the upper platform's absence in service, the lower platform's constant vibration, and the junction east of the station where the line geometry tightens and the city's engineering becomes audible. Because the story of closure does not begin on the day the gates were locked, it begins earlier, in small warnings that were treated as routine, and in the slow conversion of routine into permanent. It begins with the kinds of defects that do not look like defects to anyone who is not trained to see them. A crack that follows a rivet line, a corrosion bloom at a column base where water stands after rain, a timber that darkens not from age but from repeated saturation, a bolt that has moved by a fraction of an inch because vibration has patiently negotiated with friction. At Myrtle Avenue Broadway, those details were once distributed along an entire line, west through Fort Greene and downtown Brooklyn, carried on steel that was never designed to last forever. And when the line was finally cut, the city did not just remove a route, it created a sealed space inside a living station and left it there, an internal reminder that the system is always older than it claims. The language of structural failure is precise, but it is rarely spoken precisely in public. To reconstruct what happened, you have to think like an inspector and read like an archivist. You have to accept that the most consequential warnings are often boring. A steel elevated line is not one structure. It is a sequence of structures: bents, columns, cross-girders, stringers, track ties, fasteners, connected by the repeating demand of moving loads. Every train is a controlled impact. Every stop is a controlled transfer of energy into heat and vibration. Every curve imposes lateral forces that do not exist on straight track, and those forces are paid for in rail wear, wheel flange wear, and stress at connections that were not meant to flex indefinitely. At Myrtle Avenue Broadway, the geometry is complicated by necessity. Just east of the station, the M train branches away through an S-curve to the Myrtle Avenue line. The J and Z continue on the Jamaica line. This divergence occurs through a level junction with slip switches, one of the few remaining examples on revenue tracks. It is exactly the kind of location where minor misalignment becomes noise, where noise becomes wear, and where wear becomes a maintenance schedule that cannot be ignored without consequence. In the decades when the upper level still carried trains toward downtown Brooklyn, this station structure handled not only vertical load, but also the distribution of passengers moving between levels. The upper station opened in 1889, the lower in 1888. Both were products of a time when the elevated railway was expanding quickly, and the idea of end of useful life had not yet entered public vocabulary.
But steel's useful life is not infinite. The MTA's own modern infrastructure messaging states the simple fact that outdoor steel structures require regular painting because paint forms a barrier against corrosion. It is not aesthetic, it is protective. When that barrier breaks down, water and weather begin to do a slow, consistent job. On an elevated line, water is constant. It falls from the sky, it condenses from humid air, it travels along surfaces and collects at crevices, it sits at column bases where debris gathers. When winter comes, it freezes and expands. When salt is present, either from street treatment or marine air, it accelerates corrosion. The structure may still look intact, it may still sound strong, but strength is being consumed. The Myrtle Avenue Elevated was old enough that its protective cycles depended on institutional continuity, consistent money, consistent labor, consistent attention. In the mid-20th century, that continuity fractured. Elevated lines across the city were being removed in favor of subways and the rising primacy of the automobile. Under Robert Moses, highways were cut through neighborhoods near the Myrtle L, and the political appetite to preserve old elevated structures declined. Declining appetite leads to declining investment, and declining investment leads to a specific kind of technical problem, a structure that is maintained just enough to keep running, but not enough to restore its original margin of safety. When people discuss the 1969 closure, the story is often told as nostalgia and policy, the last wooden cars in North America, the decision not to spend money reinforcing the line for steel cars, the end of a visible landmark. But in engineering terms, the crucial phrase is reinforcing the tracks for steel cars. That phrase implies that the structure was judged adequate for the lighter, older rolling stock, but not for the heavier, modern cars that would replace it. Weight is not the only factor. Dynamic loading matters too, but weight is the simplest to communicate. The Myrtle Avenue line's operational history supports that inference. The nycsubway.org description notes that service south of Broadway was operated with older wooden body cars into the late 1950s, and then with modified Q cars until 1968, making it the last line in the city still using wooden body elevated cars. It describes the current line as a shadow of the former route and notes that the portion north of Broadway was rebuilt to heavier standards. To rebuild to heavier standards means the structure's capacity and detailing were adapted for modern loads, new steel, new connections, often new concrete decks or reinforcements. It also means that the portion not rebuilt remained defined by older assumptions. This is where early warnings tend to hide, at interfaces between old and new, and at places where replacement was partial rather than total. A station like Myrtle Avenue Broadway is an interface by design. It is a transfer point. It is a junction point. It is also a time boundary. Above an 1889 platform that ceased serving passengers in 1969, below an 1888 station still in use. In 2017, the MTA began a major rebuild of two vital pieces of infrastructure on the Myrtle Avenue line, the Fresh Pond Bridge and the Myrtle Viaduct, stating that both were over a century old and had deteriorated to the point where full replacement was necessary. The work required long-term service changes, including shutting down the connection between Myrtle Wyckoff and Myrtle Broadway for a period. That statement, end of useful life, is modern and careful, but it is structurally related to the logic that ended the Western Myrtle Avenue Elevated in 1969, a recognition that maintenance had reached the limit of what it could plausibly recover. So what did structural safety failures look like in the years leading up to the closure? The historical documents that would answer that most directly, inspection reports, defect logs, internal memoranda, are not easily surfaced in public in complete form. Some exist only as references in secondary research, others remain locked in agency archives. but the broad technical pattern is knowable because the failure modes of elevated steel structures are consistent. Corrosion at column bases is one. The base of a column is where loads transfer into foundations. It is also where water and street contaminants accumulate. Corrosion reduces cross-sectional area, which reduces capacity. More importantly, it can undermine connection points and create stress concentrations where cracks initiate. Fatigue cracking is another. Repeated cycles of load can initiate microcracks at rivet holes, weld toes, or sharp transitions. Those cracks may remain stable for years, then grow. The structure continues to carry trains while the crack quietly lengthens because steel does not announce its weakening until it is forced to. Connection loosening is another. Vibrations can loosen bolts. Riveted connections can work over time, especially if corrosion has reduced friction and altered fit. Small movements become larger. Alignment shifts, sometimes so subtly that it is first detected not by sight but by sound. A different pitch as a train passes, a sharper impact at a joint, an unfamiliar resonance in the steel. Timber degradation also matters. Older elevated lines relied on timber ties and wooden structural elements in places. Timber does not fail like steel. It rots, splinters, and compresses. It creates unevenness in the trackbed that accelerates wear. Water intrusion and freeze-thaw damage affect concrete decks and anchor points, especially in transitional structures where concrete and steel meet. The Myrtle viaduct connection between the Jamaica and Myrtle lines, documented in early 20th century imagery and later rebuilt, has been described as needing replacement after a century of maintenance. The Myrtle Avenue elevated in its western segment had an additional problem. It was politically expendable. Declining ridership in the Depression era and alternative routes weakened its status. By the time the MTA was newly formed in the late 1960s, the line was old and competing with other priorities. In that environment, early warnings become patterns: repeated small repairs, patched paint, localized reinforcements, temporary speed restrictions, and a culture of keeping it moving rather than rebuilding. Witness accounts captured in later writing underline a sensory aspect of the line's decline. Writers described the Myrtle Avenue L as reliable, but also as a machine from another century: wooden platforms, old cars, worn seating. Even nostalgic descriptions contain a key detail. The experience of the line was one of exposure: open windows, wind, the smell of industry. Exposure is not just a social sensation, it is also what structures experience: wind-driven rain, temperature swings, sun and shade. All of it accelerates aging. And the station at Myrtle Avenue Broadway preserved the evidence of the decision in physical form. The upper level was not demolished, it was abandoned in place. 2 tracks were removed. The island platform remains, disused, still visible in tours and footage.
This matters because it suggests that the closure was not merely about ridership or convenience. If the structure were wholly without value, if it were safe and simply obsolete, removal would be a straightforward choice. Instead, the city removed the western portion of the line and left the upper station as a sealed relic attached to an active node. This is the kind of decision that often follows structural concern. Remove what you can afford to remove, seal what you cannot immediately dismantle, and keep the rest operating. Over time, sealed spaces develop their own hazards. Dust accumulates, water finds ways in, metal sweats, electrical conduits age. The space becomes a maintenance liability, but also a psychological one. Workers who pass through it at night describe it differently from passengers who never see it. Even without sensationalism, the idea is plain. A void inside a public system changes how the system feels, especially to those tasked with keeping it alive. The modern MTA's rebuild narrative admits a system-wide reality. Aging assets demand increased maintenance, and if reconstruction is not done, the risk becomes catastrophic failures and disruptions. That is not a horror statement. It is a neutral administrative warning, but it contains the seed of dread. The possibility of failure exists not because someone intended harm, but because time and complexity are indifferent. So when we treat the title as a historical mystery, Myrtle Avenue Station closed after structural safety failures, the question is not whether the structure was haunted or cursed. The question is whether the city recognized in the late 1960s that the elevated west of Broadway could not be trusted under future conditions, and whether that recognition arrived through a slow accumulation of minor defects that were never dramatic enough to become famous. In the next part, the story moves into the years when those minor defects stop being minor, when service changes become permanent, and when people closest to the structure, operators, maintenance crews, and residents beneath the tracks begin to describe a different kind of pattern, not supernatural, but systematic, and therefore harder to argue with.
The last days of a rail line are rarely announced by a single event. In New York, they are announced by substitutions. First, there is the bus. Then there is the temporary schedule that becomes normal. Then there is the missing train that no one expects to return. When the Myrtle Avenue L's western portion shut down, the replacement was the B54 bus toward J Street, and the city treated it as an adequate exchange. Steel and speed replaced by rubber and traffic. The documentation of the closure day is clearer than the documentation of the failures that made it inevitable. October 4th, 1969. The line from Broadway to Bridge J Streets closed, ending the MJ service, and demolition came soon after. But closure is not the end of risk. It is the end of public exposure to a risk. The risk remains for the people who dismantle what is left. There are photographs of demolition near J Street in 1970, steel being cut down, removed from the skyline. It looks like progress to those who wanted light back on the street. It looks like amputation to those who used the line as a daily artery. From a structural perspective, demolition is also the moment when a structure's hidden conditions become visible. Corroded interiors of columns, plates thinned by decades of moisture, rivets that held through sheer habit. Workers see the true cross-sections. Inspectors see whether their caution was justified. The public rarely sees this. The public sees the clean absence afterward. Accounts from the time of closure emphasize two competing truths. One is that the Myrtle Avenue L was old reliable, a line that ran when other things failed. Another is that officials had reached a point of no return. Either money had to be made available or the line had to be discontinued because it would cost millions to repair and strengthen it for modern cars. Those statements can coexist. Reliability in daily operation does not prove structural health. A structure can carry load many times until it cannot. The absence of disaster is not evidence of safety. It is only evidence that the threshold has not been crossed yet. In the months surrounding a closure like this, there are often disturbing accounts that do not reach the level of official incident reports. These are not ghost stories. They are the kinds of small observations that people share because they cannot keep them private. Residents beneath elevated structures talk about falling debris, flakes of paint, small rust fragments, bits of hardened residue. They learn to distinguish harmless dust from something heavier. In later decades across the city, elevated lines would prompt inspection blitzes after debris falls. That pattern is documented in news coverage of the MTA's elevated infrastructure, the need to respond to visible symptoms that suddenly force attention. At Myrtle Avenue Broadway, the structure's audible language is harsher than at many stations because of the junction. The slip switches east of the station, the crossings and merges create a specific soundscape: squeal on curve, sharp impacts, the duller thud of cars transitioning between track conditions. On a healthy structure, those sounds are still present, but they are contained. They do not feel like the building is arguing with itself. When a structure is stressed, the sound seems to carry deeper, as though the steel is acting as a speaker cone, broadcasting internal movement. The horror here is not the sound itself, but the possibility that sound becomes the only early warning most people ever receive. In the late 1960s, when the Myrtle Avenue L was nearing its western termination, many riders would have noticed the line's age physically. The wooden cars, the open windows, the sense of being in something that belonged to an earlier city. A retired rider later described cane seating that could damage clothing and the smell of neighborhoods passing through open air. These are intimate details, and they contain an unspoken admission. The equipment was worn enough to affect daily life. Worn equipment does not automatically mean unsafe structure, but in the transit world, aging tends to cluster. When capital investment is deferred, everything ages together: cars, track, signals, stations, and the steel above the street. The system becomes a patchwork where some areas are modernized and others are simply kept functional by habit. The Myrtle Avenue line's own history notes this pattern explicitly. The portion north of Broadway was rebuilt to heavier standards, while the portion south and west was ultimately removed. A city that rebuilds one half and abandons the other is making a judgment about where future load will be placed, both in engineering terms and in political terms. As closure approached, there were protests. People argued not only about convenience, but about rights, about the absence of hearings, about the hardship imposed. The point is not to romanticize protests. The point is to note what the city's decision did. It forced residents to choose between the risk of the deteriorating structure and the certainty of isolation from downtown Brooklyn. When a transit line closes, the city's geography changes immediately for the people who depend on it. The remaining Myrtle Avenue line today operates as a spur from the Jamaica line into Bushwick, Ridgewood, and Middle Village. The former western stretch into Fort Greene and downtown Brooklyn is gone. The result is not only a change in commutes, it is a change in how neighborhoods can be imagined. Direct rail connection creates a sense of closeness between places that are otherwise separated by street grids, traffic, and social boundaries. When that connection is removed, the city becomes larger and more segmented. In the 1970s, those neighborhoods endured other kinds of stress: disinvestment, arson, decline. The removal of a major transit artery did not cause those events alone, but it contributed to the environment in which neglect could accumulate. The physical removal of the elevated structure exposed drabness and poverty beneath it, as some contemporary commentary observed. The structure had been both a blight and a cover. When it was removed, the street was not automatically healed, it was simply revealed. The darkest period in this story is therefore not a single night. It is a phase of the city where structural reality, political decision-making, and neighborhood vulnerability overlapped. And the station at Myrtle Avenue Broadway carried that overlap forward into the future in the form of its abandoned upper level. The upper platform is still physically present. The tracks are gone, but the space remains, sealed and unused, visible in tours and videos. There is footage showing its emptiness from within: platform edge, fencing, the suggestion of where trains once ran toward downtown Brooklyn. There is also footage of the Myrtle Avenue L in the 1950s and 1960s, moving images that show the line as living infrastructure, not as a memory. What is disturbing about these documents is not that the place looks frightening, it is that the place looks ordinary. It looks like any other station until you notice the missing track bed, the dead-end passages, a second level that does not participate in the city's daily exchange. From an investigative standpoint, that upper level functions like a retained specimen. It is a physical record of a decision that was made under structural pressure.
It reminds anyone who thinks about it seriously that the system can, and does, amputate itself when load and time exceed capacity. Modern agency language, again not sensational, warns of catastrophic failures if foundational assets are not reconstructed. Those words are not tied publicly to Myrtle Avenue Broadway in a single neat narrative, but they describe the general truth that the Myrtle Avenue L's closure demonstrated half a century earlier. There are moments when a structure is judged too far gone to justify saving, and the city decides that removing it is safer than carrying it forward. In the next part, the story moves into the long aftermath. What happens to a place that is not fully closed, only partially sealed? How records thin out, how maintenance culture adapts to the presence of an unused level, and how the psychological presence of a closed station inside an open station persists, not as a ghost, but as a structural memory that cannot be renovated away. After closure, the city's instinct is to forget quickly. Forgetting is a civic function. It allows new routes to be drawn, new budgets to be justified, new promises to be made without accounting for the cost of what was removed. The western Myrtle Avenue Elevated was demolished soon after the October 1969 shutdown. In some neighborhoods, demolition was experienced as relief. The sky opened, the noise receded, light returned to street-level windows. Real estate arguments followed, as they often do. The removal of elevated structures was framed as an aesthetic improvement that could lift property values. The logic was clean, almost antiseptic. But Myrtle Avenue Broadway did not permit full forgetting because it retained the upper level. The station became a contradiction, a functioning transit node with a sealed annex that once carried a major route into downtown Brooklyn. The upper platform level is not a rumor, it is in the station's official description. Opened April 27, 1889, closed October 4, 1969, and it remains physically present though disused. From a distance, this might seem like a curiosity, the sort of abandoned platform detail that transit enthusiasts trade among themselves. But for a maintenance system, an abandoned level is not a curiosity. It is an ongoing liability that must be managed with quiet routine. Keep it sealed, keep it stable, ensure no one enters, ensure nothing falls, ensure water does not turn it into a slow corrosion incubator above an active platform. This is one of the reasons the aftermath of structural failure is rarely peaceful. You cannot fully bury the past when the past is bolted to the present. There are videos documenting the abandoned upper level, filmed in a tone that is observational rather than dramatic. The emptiness is straightforward. The platform edge, the fencing, the muted daylight, the sense of space designed for crowds now permanently unavailable. The footage is important not because it reveals secrets, but because it confirms that the city's closure did not end in total removal, it left a chamber behind. The psychological presence of that chamber persists in small ways. People who ride the lower levels sometimes feel, without knowing why, that they are beneath something unfinished. Workers understand it more concretely. There is a part of the station where the normal rules are suspended. In active public space, every surface is designed to be seen and used. In sealed space, surfaces are designed only to endure. A sealed platform does not need to look safe, it needs to be safe enough not to become a hazard to the space below it. Over decades, that difference becomes institutionalized. The station continues to be described as a two-level structure, with the upper level abandoned. It continues to sit above a complex junction where the M branches away from the J/Z through an at-grade slip-switch junction, and the city continues to rely on the remaining Myrtle Avenue line spur into Queens and Eastern Brooklyn, a remnant of what was once a more complete network. The long-term effect is that the closure becomes normalized as geography. Riders who arrive in New York after 1969 do not miss what they never had. They treat the bus replacement and the indirect routes as an ordinary inconvenience.
Meanwhile, older residents remember a direct rail line to downtown Brooklyn as a lost organ. But forgetting does not stop structural aging, it simply shifts it elsewhere. The modern MTA's rebuild framing is not specific to Myrtle Avenue Broadway, but it describes a system-wide condition. Much of the network is old, out of date, and in need of replacement to prevent catastrophic failures and disruptions. It emphasizes hidden infrastructure, power substations, shops, tunnels, and structures supporting tracks as essential and vulnerable. In that context, Myrtle Avenue's story reads less like an isolated historical mistake and more like an early example of a pattern the city still struggles with. Maintain until maintenance is no longer credible, then shut down or rebuild under pressure. The Myrtle Avenue line itself provides a modern case study of that pressure. In the 2010s, agencies described the Myrtle Viaduct and Fresh Pond Bridge as over a century old and deteriorated to the point where full replacement was necessary rather than partial repair, leading to major shutdowns and service changes. The work was not presented as optional. It was described as a requirement to preserve service and prepare for future demands. This is what the afterlife of a structural failure looks like. The closure of one segment does not end the need for structural vigilance, it merely relocates attention to the segments that remain. In Myrtle Avenue Broadway's case, the station is also undergoing modernization for accessibility. The MTA announced it would become ADA accessible as part of the 2020 to 2024 capital program, and work on elevators began in December 2024. These are visible signs of investment, and they will change how the station functions for riders. But accessibility upgrades do not erase the station's deeper structural narrative. They are applied to a structure that still carries its own history in steel. The lasting horror of this place is not that it is overtly dangerous today. The horror is that the city can build a system so large that it contains sealed ruins within active corridors, and then treat those ruins as normal. It is that the public can be asked to trust a machine they cannot evaluate, while the machine contains evidence that trust has been withdrawn before. In the decades after 1969, the Myrtle Avenue L became a story people told in fragments. Family memories of wooden cars, arguments about whether demolition improved the street, debates about whether the city made a mistake. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained concentrated at Myrtle Avenue Broadway, a station where one level operates and one does not. Even the station's official layout reflects this duality: lower level with multiple tracks and island platforms, upper level with former tracks removed, platform disused. In a city that prides itself on motion, a disused platform is the most honest form of stillness. It is not curated like a museum exhibit. It is not cleaned for tours except occasionally. It is simply held in suspension, kept from interfering with the city below it. Over time, such spaces become magnets for speculation. People ask why it is still there. The practical answers are usually sufficient: cost of removal, structural complexity, the need to avoid disrupting active service. But speculation persists because the space is visibly absent from daily life while physically present. The city has created a void and then asked everyone not to think about it. To understand Myrtle Avenue Broadway as a station closed after structural safety failures is to accept that closure can be partial and lasting. The upper levels closure in 1969 was the result of a line being judged too costly to upgrade for modern loads, and the decision turned that judgment into architecture: the abandonment of an entire route and the sealing of a platform inside a working station. It is a closure that remains visible every time a train arrives below. In the present day, the Myrtle Avenue line is still a place where age and maintenance are openly acknowledged. Agencies speak about deterioration and the necessity of full replacement for century-old structures. They speak about corrosion on elevated steel and the need for painting as a first line of defense. They speak about rebuilding to avoid catastrophic failures. These are not admissions of guilt, they are admissions of time. And time is the quiet antagonist in this documentary because it operates without malice. It does not need intention, it only needs neglect. It only needs the long intervals between paint cycles, the years when budgets tighten, the moments when inspectors downgrade a condition from urgent to monitor because there is no labor available to fix it immediately. At Myrtle Avenue, Broadway, the evidence of what time can do is not hidden deep in a tunnel. It is above the heads of passengers in daylight, a closed level that looks down on the open one. The city has, in effect, preserved its own warning inside one of its busiest kinds of places, a station where people wait without thinking about load paths, and where the structure remembers every train that ever passed through.